Thank you, Angel. Good afternoon and welcome to the Advanced Practitioner Series. My name is Patrick Shepard. I'm very pleased to be joined today by Cheryl Keem-Piasecki. Welcome, Cheryl.
Thanks, Patrick.
And today we're going to be talking about annual ethics training and provide you some tools that you can use to put to work in your program sort of immediately. And this is something that we know you have been aware of and you've been asking for a long time, that you'd like OGE to support more fully your annual ethics training programs. And we agree. And what we'd like to do is have this be the beginning of seasonal reinforcements to assist you in your annual ethics training. So this is the first in this set of scenarios, but it won't be the last. And we're also very pleased that a number of ethics officials have been able to share with us their insights and thoughts and input into these scenarios. So these aren't something that we just put together here at OGE on our own. We had input from more than a dozen agencies. And if you submitted comments after our presentation in July on instructor approaches, you also had input into these scenarios. So we're very pleased to be here today to share them with you. And do we have any administrative announcements today, Cheryl?
We do have a broadcast next week for the Inspectors General community.
That's correct. So next Thursday, the chief of the Ethics Law and Policy branch here at OGE, Seth Jaffe, will be joining us to conduct a broadcast for IG investigators on ways that the ethics program and OGE in particular can assist in conflicts of interest investigations. So if that's something that's interesting to you, we will be sending out a listserv. You could share it with your IG folks at your agencies, or if you're just interested in having a look, we'd welcome your participation as well. And we'll probably be back next month with our regularly scheduled Fundamental Series and Advanced Practitioner Series. We also look forward to seeing you at the National Government Ethics Summit in March.
Which is coming up very, very quickly.
Really, really quickly.
Quicker than any of us.
Terrifyingly quickly.
Terrifyingly quickly, yes.
But we are looking forward to that, and we're looking forward to seeing you for the virtual summit or in person if you join us in DC. So today we're talking about annual ethics training scenarios. And what we'd like to do is first share with you some of the ways that they came about, some of the discussions we had with your colleagues that produced this set of scenarios, talk a little bit about objectives of annual ethics training, and then share with you some ways that you can use these scenarios to facilitate discussions with different sized audiences. So should we go ahead and get into the slides?
Oh, absolutely. I think people have been waiting. We've been promising and promising, and we've kept our promise. So I think people have been waiting for this.
So there are some slides, and you should have received three things as part of your registration. The first thing that you should have received is the slide deck. You should have also received a link to a library of these scenarios. So rather than put them all in one slide deck, what we've done is broken each scenario into its own slide deck, so you can go and look at them based on the topic and audience and sort of plug and play and put them together to create a training program that works for you and your audience.
And we will be adding to that library, correct, Patrick?
That's right. So these are the first 10, and sort of an interesting time to discuss how we ended up with these 10. Back in late summer, early fall, I hosted some focus groups with 4 groups of ethics officials. We have between 4 and 6 people for each of those focus groups, where we were discussing training scenarios for specific groups of employees. And we've not abandoned the idea of creating targeted scenarios. But what I found when I was going through the hundreds of scenarios and ideas that we came up with across those 4 focus groups is that we had some overlap. And there were some scenarios that really apply to any audiences. So we kind of wanted to start there. So we provide you with something that everyone can use. So you might not have scientists at your agency, so the scientists' scenarios might not be useful to you. Likewise, law enforcement or contracting personnel. But these are for a general audience. They had overlap amongst the 4 groups. So we'll start here. You can try them out. If you like them, you can provide us feedback. If you think there's something we should change in the format, we can entertain those ideas as well. And use those to inform our more targeted scenarios. But the goal is to have kind of a universal toolkit.
And these are sort of common situations that your average sort of rank and file employee might find themselves in. So I think that's the nice thing about these. We can call them generic, but I think that you're going to see that these are things that could quite commonly occur for your average rank and file employee. So so they should resonate with a large number of your employees.
And these fit into a strategy and approach to ethics training that we discussed back in July. And it's predicated on the idea that certain kinds of questions and certain kinds of scenarios facilitate participation and engagement by your attendees and participants. And we have a sort of specific idea about how that works. How do we generate engagement? How do we measure the sort of ethical awareness and intuition of our employees so that we can better meet their training needs? And we shared this with you back in July, and if you missed that broadcast, I'd encourage you to take a look at it. But basically, the idea behind all of these scenarios is that people are more willing to engage with more general questions.
Yes.
So these are questions that don't necessarily have a right or wrong answer. They ask people to consider themselves in a situation and articulate things like, what might you be thinking about? Or what might you do in this situation? What might a first step be? So these kinds of questions are behavioral, and they're also not binary, right? So there's not a wrong answer. If you say to someone, you're in this situation, what's the first thing that comes to mind? There's no wrong answer there.
Right.
We're learning about them. We're not asking them to sort of opine upon the propriety of a set of facts. And we want to move from that intuition to sort of more specific behavioral type questions. Like, what are some things that you could do if you were in this scenario? What resources are available to help you? And then finally work into the specifics of what principles apply or what rules might help us come to a determination. So that's kind of the philosophy behind all of these scenarios, is that we want to start by building engagement with general questions that allow us to assess where our employees are in their ethical intuition. This can also be helpful because it gives us an idea of how we're doing as an organization.
Right.
We can see the preferences and inclinations of the entire group of people that we might be addressing. So that's sort of the beginning step for each of these. So
well, and I think it allows employees also to sort of to own their understanding of things, which is to say that it allows them to articulate what they see in the way that they comprehend it and understand it, and not necessarily immediately forcing them into even a nomenclature that is clunky and legal and that just does not resonate with them. So I think if you can get people to engage conceptually because they're talking about the situation in a way that makes sense to them and how they understand it and experience it, then you can work with that and help move them toward a more specific understanding about how that then translates into these legalistic or other principles. But you got to let them speak their mind and speak their piece, and then then you can have real communication.
Exactly. And so we've created a simple model. It's basically a 3-step process that you can use for any of these scenarios. And we're going to talk today about how you can use it in small groups, how you can use it in large groups, and even maybe think about ways that you could do it in a virtual environment. So the first step is to assess intuition. And the way I like to begin, at least with the first scenario with a group of employees, is to give them the scenario and say, do you think, this is absolutely prohibited activity by the ethics rules? Do you think there are some questions that we might need to ask or deal with before we move forward? Or do we think there's no problem here at all? In a large room, you can do that with a show of hands. With a small room, you can go around the room and have people sort of give you their intuition about the matter. And then from there, you can move on to discussing principles that might inform our decision-making and behavior, and finally look at the rules that might be controlling or may just help to sort of direct us towards a resolution. So today, and for all of these scenarios, we have some objectives. And we have objectives both for instructors and participants. We think ethics training is an activity that we undertake as ethics officials that is both about ensuring a level of awareness in our employees, but it's also something that happens and is important for us as ethics officials to gain understanding from our participants and employees. So for our instructors, our objectives are to assess the ethical awareness of participants, find out how your organization thinks about ethics, find out how they deal with scenarios, find out what resources they believe are available to them to deal with ethics scenarios. We'd also like you to help participants anticipate and identify ethics questions in the wild. So I think this is kind of an important thing. I think oftentimes, because we as ethics officials answer ethics questions, we think ethics training should be about answering ethics questions.
And that's not how employees experience ethical situations. They don't have a prefabricated fact pattern that's presented to them for them to identify where the ethics issue lies.
Yeah, exactly. Like, while I have an email box that's called ethics questions,
Right.
they do not receive ethics questions that way. They just receive work or an invitation or a circumstance or a conversation with a friend.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't even necessarily recognize those things as ethics scenarios or places where ethics might be implicated.
Right.
So that's the awareness that we want to build. And you'll see when we get to the scenarios that these aren't ethics questions.
No, they're
right?
not.
They're not full fact patterns.
They're situations.
They're situations that someone might find themselves in.
Right.
And we want them to imagine, anticipate, and identify the questions that are going to come up from the scenario so that they can ask them.
Well, and this is a way also of making sure that people are integrating ethics into their daily decision-making processes, that they're recognizing that in their day-to-day operations, in their day-to-day work activity, that ethics situations occur. And that's the only way that they can learn to recognize them is by practicing identifying them in common situations in which they might find themselves.
Exactly. And it's interesting, when we were talking to ethics officials during the development process back in the summer and fall, one thing that I noticed was that in a lot of training materials, I saw fact patterns and scenarios that looked like they could have been taken straight out of an ethics opinion.
Right.
And I made an inquiry. I said, well, where does this come from? Like, why did you decide to present the scenario in a way that's sort of element by element a 208 situation? And in fact, that's exactly where the scenario had come from. It had been lifted directly from the facts paragraph of an ethics opinion. And that's great if you're trying to teach ethics officials how to analyze ethics scenarios and write ethics opinions. But what we need our employees to be able to do is be able to seek ethics opinions.
Right. Not answer their own ethics questions necessarily.
Exactly. So that's what we want to do. We want to teach participants when and how to ask ethics questions. And at the end, participants should have an awareness of the ethics rules and principles. We don't need to make them experts. They don't need to be able to name the elements of 208. They don't need to be able to cite chapter and verse the exemptions and exceptions to the GIFts rules. They just need to know there are GIFts rules and here are places where I need to ask questions and be able to deal with the common situations that they face as employees. So we want them to identify and demonstrate an ability to ask effective ethics questions. So during the course, what you should try and do is get employees to identify and indeed ask the questions.
Right.
To say, I think if this were me in this situation, I would ask the following question, or I could see this question coming up for this person in this scenario. That's the goal that we want to get to, not that they would be able to sort of adjudicate and write the opinion for the question.
Yeah, they're not in competition or shouldn't be in competition for your job.
That's right. And so here's sort of our framework. We want participants to use their sort of innate awareness to assess a situation first, be able to describe actions they would take if presented with a situation. Then we can work together to use the ethics principles to analyze the scenarios. And we've provided you a handy handbook.
Yes.
That we hope you'll be able to use in your annual ethics training program. And we have run this through the compliance division here at OGE. And if indeed you cover the materials in this handbook in the way that we show you how to do in just a minute, you will have complied with the requirements to provide a review of this material.
Yes.
And when you're looking at the handbook, I would point out two things. One, on the cover, there is a text field in the lower right-hand corner that is a place for you to put your contact information. So the telephone number for the ethics office can go right there. And on the last page of the handbook, there is another big text box where you can put summaries of any supplemental regulations you have. So this is a flexible tool for agencies to use right away.
Excellent.
And finally, participants and instructors should discuss strategies for ensuring the rules are applied correctly. So it's not enough for employees to be able to ask an ethics question or identify the question. They need to know who to come to.
Right.
And they need to know what processes are in place to help them come to a resolution. So this is where you'd want to talk about things like your prior approval requirements for outside activities, if you have a process for vetting invitations, if you enlist managers or supervisors in the ethics decision-making process, how they fit in. All those kinds of procedural questions are part of this framework.
Yeah, and I think it's an opportunity for you as well to sort of give people a cultural sensibility about what tolerances are in your agency. For example, if you have personal use, like de minimis use policies, to give people a sensibility about, again, like agencies' tolerances for, de minimis personal use. And, again, just to sensitize everybody to when and under what circumstances they really need to come get some advice before acting.
Excellent. And I mentioned just a moment ago our required review of the 14 principles, the standards of conduct, the conflicts of interest statutes, and any supplemental regulations that your agency might have. And we're going to show you how to do that in a really efficient way with the next scenario. So this is going to be the first scenario in our library of 10. We probably won't get an opportunity to discuss all 10 of the scenarios, but we're going to sort of show you how we would facilitate these in various ways as far as we can get in the hour, and then leave some time for questions. But in this first scenario, we're going to show you how you can go through the first scenario in your class to make it an effective review of the required materials under the training regulation. So here's our scenario.
You and your partner of many years finally decide to make it official and tie the knot.
So you've decided to get married.
Yes, you've decided to get married, and that's the situation you find yourself in. So the first thing you want to do is find out from some, ask the general question. So what do you think about this? What if any issues do you think in here in a situation where you're getting married?
Can you imagine the need to ask an ethics question in this situation?
Right.
Are there any ethics questions that come to mind? And you might have to give your participants a little bit of time to chew on that question and work through it. And I think as instructors, that can feel like a really long time. But especially in the first instance, I'd encourage you to sort of wait. And it might feel like there's a bit of a staring contest going on between you and participants, but it's important to give them time to think so that they can engage with us properly.
And if you have this extremely pregnant pause and you're still not getting any feedback from folks, I mean, you should have, available to you some discussion prompts. So if you can have a for instance, or a way to embellish it slightly so that you maybe give them more of a clue as to what sorts of things you would like them to sort of identify or think about. I mean, that's a useful thing to have too.
Yes, and in the notes for all of these scenarios, we've provided you a number of ways to ask this question and refine it in case that you don't get any engagement. But in this case, if we didn't have any response, I might ask a question like, of those of you who have spouses, what does that mean for your financial disclosure report? Right. Someone's going to be able to answer that question. You might ask about wedding gifts. Someone might volunteer that you're likely to receive gifts as part of a wedding. Someone might suggest that they think the spouse's financial holdings become the employees when they get married.
Right. And that suddenly now your spouse's employment becomes an issue for you. Where they work is something that you need to be mindful of.
So the goal here is to get those questions out of our participants,
right? To
see if they can identify and think through some of those questions. So that's step one in the process. That's where we assess the intuition and innate awareness amongst our participants. And that's great. That takes us a lot of the way towards our learning objectives. But the next thing that has to happen is we have to find out what they're going to do.
Right.
And this, in this case, there are a lot of activities that someone might need to undertake if they are in this scenario. So we would, again, ask that question. This is, again, a slightly more specific question than the first one, but still quite open-ended. So you might say, what are you going to do first? And someone might volunteer that, well, next time I have to fill out my 450 or my 278, I'm going to include my spouse's assets. It's a good suggestion to go forward. Someone might say, I'm going to seek ethics advice about, inviting people to my wedding and if there are any considerations they should have if they decide to get us a present. If someone's a supervisor, they might have a similar question. What if my staff members want to get me a present? And you'll also find that people say, well, I was in this situation and this is what we did. And I think that's okay, but could you explain why?
Right.
So you get some real procedural things. And I think a point you'd like to make here is, you'd hope that someone would come to you about the potential financial conflicts of interest immediately, not at annual filing time. And you might have some disagreement in the room there.
Right.
And that's very healthy and productive to have that discussion. But here we're looking really to some sort of functional steps that people might take next.
And this is going to be a time when you're going to have people asking. So there are going to be inquiring as to, well, so I'm a financial disclosure filer. So does that mean I have to revise my report immediately? Or do I have to let somebody know that I've gotten married? So they volunteer or are likely to volunteer some of the very kinds of procedural questions that you ideally would like to communicate to them in any event.
Right. And it would be helpful, if you've considered this scenario as an ethics official and as the instructor, to have some strategies to suggest,
right.
Depending on the circumstance. So if I say, I have a spouse of diversified mutual funds, I sort of know what they have, and I know it's not a problem for me. You might have a strategy that person could undertake, or someone whose prospective spouse may be, they have no idea, they're quite wealthy. You could have some advice for how they could manage that situation.
Yeah, they have a prenup or something,
right.
Something complex that's really going to require some time and some thought. At least I think gives you a heads up.
And I think you and I, Cheryl, have used this method a few times with fairly large groups of employees in some agencies. And at least the first few times you use them, it's astonishing the variety of questions and permutations that come to light, and you realize that there are really a lot of questions that you wouldn't have considered, but are real and live and maybe need addressed.
And it's interesting too, the level of sophistication that you have among your annual file or your annual trainees, people who are filers and get the training on an annual basis, that when you give them the opportunity to sort of talk about it, and again, in a non-legalistic, controlled fact pattern kind of way, that it is rather striking, their sensibilities about it and their ability to analogize and extrapolate and to see how it could occur in various and sundry guises. And I think that's really useful as an ethics official to sort of hear where people are coming from and to appreciate the variety of circumstances in which they could see this happening to themselves.
Right. And I think it also helps us to make training effective in that other objective that we have. Because something strange happens in the days and weeks after we conduct annual training scenarios. And that is we get a huge influx of ethics questions.
Yes.
And when you start to use these broader scenarios that encourage people to sort of think widely about ethics questions they might have, they start to realize that they actually have some life questions they need to ask. And that's a really desirable outcome, even though the next day when you're writing 30 ethics opinions, it doesn't feel that way. So we said we're going to get to the sort of review and compliance piece and how we carry that out through this first scenario. And the tool that we've provided you is this Ethics and Public Service Supplement to Annual Ethics Training. And what I'd recommend that you do in the first instance, for the subsequent scenarios, you don't need to do this. But in the first instance, I'd really walk employees through this booklet. And what we've done here is broken down the 14 principles into 3 categories. We have loyalty to law, selfless service, and responsible stewardship. And that is that these are more easily retained by employees than the 14 enumerated principles.
Yes, remembering 14 principles is just simply not going to happen,
Yes. I've worked here for 11 years now, and I think I'd be lucky to get 12 out of 14.
And so we've distilled all 14 into these 3 categories, and we think these 3 categories fairly well encapsulate sort of the inherent sort of underpinnings of those separate principles.
And I think in the first instance, when you're walking through the first scenario, I'd go to the first principles, the loyalty to law principles here in the booklet, and look at all 3 of them and ask whether we think they're going to be implicated by the scenario, and determine one way or the other. So we go through satisfying good faith our obligations, including all just financial obligations. And someone might feel that could be implicated, might feel it couldn't be implicated, but now we've reviewed it and we understand it applies.
Right.
Likewise with adherence to laws of equal opportunity, and then avoiding actions creating the appearance that you're violating the law or ethical standards. And we may have consensus on some of these, but we want to discuss each of them in the context of the scenario.
Okay, we have a question, Patrick. It says, this sounds excellent for annual live and interactive training for experienced government employees. In your experience, does this also work as well on a webinar or conference call?
That's a good question. So obviously, when we're in a virtual platform like we are today, there's less opportunity for engagement. And if you are doing a live broadcast in this kind of format, you're going to have to do more of the lifting.
Right.
But you can still provide space for people to do some thinking.
Yes.
So if you have a mechanism for feedback like we have here, we can ask if people think each of these categories is implicated and allow them to vote or otherwise indicate, or we could just give them an opportunity to think about it before explaining our position on the matter. So, I think there are some strategies where you can use this in less than ideal training circumstances.
Yeah, and again, that's when you have polling. If you have polling tools that you can use, the point is to try to get people engaged by asking them thought-provoking questions and giving them some opportunity to interact, which could be like, as Patrick said, like we have your ability to post questions on the Hangout, or if you have a polling mechanism or something. And it may be canvassing, maybe getting 1 or 2 people to respond. Maybe you can't get everybody to give their point of view, but you can get 1 or 2 people to respond. And again, then it's for you to extrapolate from that and embellish any learning points that come from what you get.
And during our focus groups, we did have some discussions about how this format could work in a self-paced, computer-based training module.
Mm-hmm.
And there are a number of strategies you could take. For that first case, what questions might you ask? You could provide a text box where people could actually submit the questions.
Right.
And whether you decide to go back and look at those is, I guess, a matter for you to consider. But when you get to the principles, you could list all of the principles in these 3 categories and ask employees to check all that they think apply.
Right.
Likewise for the standards, the conflict of interest statutes, and the supplemental regulations. So procedurally, I think this can work in a virtual environment, though, obviously you don't get the benefit as an instructor of learning about the inclinations of your employees.
Right.
But thanks for your questions, Stuart. It's a really good one. So in this first instant, we go through the principles related to loyalty to law and determine whether we think they would help inform our actions here. Likewise, selfless service, and finally, the principles related to responsible stewardship. So at this stage, we've conducted a review of the 14 principles.
Mm-hmm.
So we're kind of a third of the way home when it comes to discussing and providing the required review under the regulation.
Right.
And we're doing that in a way that helps employees to use those principles to identify questions rather than to find answers.
Mm-hmm.
And that's very important because that's the way they experience the world.
Yeah, I mean, it's an issue spotting exercise, but you're giving them something conceptually that they can kind of get their head around. And if they move forward thinking in terms of, that they have to be concerned about situations where their loyalty to law might be questioned, or their service might be considered to be other than selfless, or they don't feel like they're being a responsible steward. I mean, if we can get those concepts in their heads, that's kind of their baseline red flag stimulators if you will, then we've gone a long way to helping people, increasing people's awareness of when they are confronting a situation where they may need to ask for the questions.
Right. And our next step is to go through the standards and the criminal conflict of interest statutes in a similar way.
Mm-hmm.
So you'll see in the book that we've provided you some very, very brief summaries of the categories of standards of conduct and the conflict of interest laws.
Mm-hmm.
And we've done that with an eye towards helping employees to know when they're in the universe or the ballpark of needing to ask a question where one of these will be implicated.
Mm-hmm.
So similarly to our process with the principles, we want to look at this question and say, use of government position. Do you think, there's a possibility for misuse of position as a result of this scenario? And employees might have some ideas about that.
Right.
Right. They might say, well, one time I shared a cubicle with someone who was planning a wedding, and they spent very little time working and a lot of time planning a wedding. And that might be a good opportunity to have a discussion about misuse of position. Likewise, conflicting financial interests. Someone might, raise that, we have new financial interests as a result of our nuptials.
Mm-hmm.
So do we need to consider those? And you can have a discussion about how an employee should go about addressing that potential concern. Likewise, our gifts between employees and outside sources. Someone's going to immediately notice that there are opportunities for gift exchange anytime you have a wedding.
Mm-hmm.
And they might ask you a series of questions about that. Outside activities, they may say, it doesn't seem that that's applicable here.
Mm-hmm.
But they are at least aware that those rules apply. Likewise, seeking employment, and it's an opportunity to discuss impartiality in the context of a spouse's employer as well.
Right.
So in this one scenario, in just a few minutes, we're 2/3 of the way done.
Yeah, we've covered virtually
review.
every subpart of the standards of conduct. Yeah.
Exactly. And we've done it in a functional way.
Right.
Where we're using the standards to raise questions and to identify questions in the wild, as we said.
And we're not burying people in the niceties and in the granularity of the way the regulations are actually written. I mean, we give ourselves an opportunity, if they ask more specific questions, to be able to provide a little bit more information, but we're not making them wade through, regulatory language in order to just decide whether or not they think they have a question.
Exactly. And, we at OGE, we realize that it's impossible in an hour or even a day to go through the elements of all of these rules. When we teach new ethics officials the basics of being an ethics official, it takes us 9 days.
Right.
Right. So we don't imagine that you can get through an elemental analysis of all of the laws and regulations in a short period of time.
Mm-hmm.
But what we do think you can do is create an awareness of all of those provisions.
Mm-hmm.
So finally, what we'll do is go through the criminal conflicts of interest statutes in the same way. And here we're looking for whether, sort of what the general prohibitions are and whether or not we think they'll be implicated in this scenario. So we go through the criminal conflicts of interest statutes as they are provided in the book. And finally, if you have any supplemental regulations, you could take this opportunity to look at those and again decide, whether or not they're going to be implicated in this scenario, or whether or not we just don't need to worry about them because they're not applicable to the questions we've identified so far.
Mm-hmm. So it's an economy of time and effort and focus, and but it also enables an employee to better appreciate actually the complexity of certain very basic scenarios that they find themselves in, and to be able to appreciate sort of the universe of things that could be an issue, in a situation as basic as you're getting married.
Exactly. Which seems not to immediately come
Obvious,
to mind as an ethics issue at all. But then when you consider it, there are lots of ethical implications.
Right.
And actually, I think when you start having discussions with employees, you'll find that there are more than even you imagined, that people will come up with ethics questions that even you didn't consider. Mm-hmm. And that's a good outcome here. So that's the way that I would recommend you go through the first scenario to get through your review in sort of reasonable amount of time. And you've also armed your employees to move more briskly through the next scenarios that you would like to cover. Mm-hmm. So you can decide how many scenarios you think is appropriate. But after you've done one, you've conducted your review, and you can really focus on the issues that you think are going to be important to employees.
And if you wanted to actually, with these scenarios, once you've oriented them to the process, if you wanted to, you could actually allow them to sort of spend a little time in small groups. Like if you have a relatively small group and you're doing it live training, to have them work in small groups and talk among themselves about situations, and then maybe debrief them in the large group. So you don't have to feel like, I don't think you have to feel like you literally have to walk them through every one of these scenarios to achieve the objectives of the training.
That's exactly right. So if we have small groups, that's fantastic. Mm-hmm. What if we have enormous groups of people? I've been in situations where you might have 200 or 300 people in an auditorium, mm-hmm. and you want to provide them meaningful ethics training, but circumstances demand that you do that, in a large format, mm-hmm. and that's fine. So this next one, let's talk through how we would go through this as mm-hmm. a second scenario in a large room.
Okay.
So our scenario here is your great aunt passes away and leaves you with a significant inheritance. Mm-hmm. Again, this doesn't jump out as an ethics question, probably, mm-hmm. for our employees. So the first question is, what do you think? Mm-hmm. And if I was working in a large group, I would start with that stoplight. Mm-hmm. And I would say, who thinks there is no conceivable ethics question, no issue here at all? We can just proceed without any further consideration, and get a show of hands. Mm-hmm. And then I go, who thinks this is just impossible under the ethics rules? Like, we're going to have to give the inheritance back.
Which will get you a laugh, at least.
Right, which will get you a laugh. And does anyone feel that way? And you'll find that almost everyone in your group of people is going to be in the middle when you ask the final question, which is, do you think there's some issues we need to consider? Everyone's going to raise their hand. Mm-hmm. And something interesting happens when people raise their hands. They invite you to call upon them. So you've in a way, tricked them into volunteering. But the key to making this work is to remember the broad, no wrong answer question.
Yes.
People will be very patient and very willing to help you if you don't put them on the spot.
Yes.
And by asking them a question, you have not put them on the spot if you ask the question correctly. Mm-hmm. So a question that I might ask is, you think there's some risk here. Could you share with me maybe the first thing that came to mind? Mm-hmm. Is there a piece of information that you'd like to be able to start thinking about it? Mm-hmm. Those kinds of open-ended, no wrong answer questions.
Yes, just volunteering people, so asking people to volunteer their thoughts in a non-binary way.
Exactly. So we can talk about thoughts, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
You know, what are we thinking? What is the first thing we'd want to find out? Is there something you learned last year that you think might be applicable here?
Mm-hmm.
You know, things that are really easy for people to volunteer.
Mm-hmm.
And from there, you can kind of open the discussion up, and you'll find that, you know, people are willing to do that. And if you want to sort of get that discussion started in a small group, you can do that even in a large group.
Yes.
You can ask employees to speak with their neighbor.
Yes.
And say, you know, between you and your neighbor, think about 3 things that, you know, sort of come to mind here,
Mm-hmm.
or come up with a first step that you'd be willing to take,
Mm-hmm.
which makes your question asking even easier, because you could say, you guys looked like you were having a good discussion. Can you share something that you talked about?
Exactly.
It's a non-threatening, easy way to engage, but you're also ensuring that people are engaged in the thinking.
Yeah, I mean, you can ask questions like, did any of you find that you and the person next to you thought of the same things? And if you get show of hands, well, what can you share with us what it was that you had? Or did somebody have something that was just completely they thought was completely off the wall? And, you know, would you be willing to share that? But something where you know, again, you're inviting them to think about it.
Right.
And if you can give them an opportunity to discuss it with someone, great. But find non-threatening ways to get them to share whatever thoughts had come into their head.
Exactly. So we're starting with that really broad question. And we're moving to a slightly less broad question. And we might ask the group if they're willing to volunteer a first step they would take, or a piece of information that they go gather, or the identity of a person that they would enlist to help them work through the scenario. Sort of simple, functional questions. And it gives you an opportunity to finish the story for them.
Right.
Right. So they say, you know, I think I'd want to find out from, you know, whoever's settling the estate, you know, what I'm receiving.
Right.
And then I think maybe that information would be helpful to bring to my supervisor or an ethics official to talk about potential conflicts of interest. And it's like, that's a fantastic question, right? You've made our lives easier. You're going to make it easier to work through this process because you have collected the correct information and you've helped us to work with you. And then you could describe the steps that you would take to work with them to sort of resolve any potential issues. So that's a positive experience, and hopefully it feels very customer service oriented to the employees, rather than kind of scolding and, you know, you should have and you may not.
Yeah, and again, I think this is another one where you could sort of feed some possible answers to the audience, and sort of, but in a question format, like, how many of you would your first course of action be to, you know, as Patrick suggested, how many of you would your first course of action be to get clarification about what it was you were actually going to receive? You know, how many of you would share any information you had with your, you know, ethics official? Like, you know, and so actually sort of like, rather than if you have trouble with an audience getting that kind of information out of them, sort of prompting them with some possible things they could do, or are likely to do. Exactly.
It's always good to start with an easy question, but know that you have some easier questions held in reserve, in case you sort of get the stonewall of silence. And then we can move through. Since we've already gone through the principles, we can ask folks if they think any of the categories of principles might apply. And we can go through very simply in a large group and poll, you know, do you think any of the principles in loyalty to law section apply? Do you think any in selfless service apply, responsible stewardship? And if someone's willing to volunteer which of those principles, all the better. There aren't many in each of these categories, so we can even poll through that process.
Right.
If we have people who say we think some of the loyalty to law principles apply, we can then go through the 3 of them and ask, you know, do you think the first one, second one, third one? And you can sort of see how the room is working with and thinking about the principles. And finally, we can do the same thing with the ethics, the conflicts of interest statutes, and the standard of conduct. You know, we can ask people which they think apply, or we could simply explain how they apply and why it's important for people to seek advice. We could say, you know, this could be implicated, and the questions you've identified are the correct ones, and here's how we process that for you.
And I think this is going to be a matter of you sort of judging for yourself, A, how many of these scenarios you want to get through, and then B, like kind of what time is available to you, and like what people's patience will be for like continuing to volunteer information, because I think that you have to engage them early on, and I think you have to engage them at least in part of this process. But as Patrick just suggested, you may very well find that once you get to the rules and statutes, that just out of an efficiency a need for efficiency of time and whatever, that you find yourself providing more of the sort of guideposts to these would be the rules that would be implicated or might likely be implicated based upon the suggestions that you all made about things that you identified that you thought might be at issue.
Yep. So that's the strategy for a huge group of people.
Mm-hmm.
And it can work and it can be effective. And all of us would like to do training sort of one-on-one or in small groups where we can have, really good, robust discussions.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes you can't. And, this is still effective and it
Mm-hmm.
still achieves the goal of helping people to identify questions, learn how to ask them, and apply the principles and rules in context.
Right.
So here's another one. And let's go through this one as if we were working with a really small group.
Okay.
So maybe you're working with your executive staff, maybe a dozen people.
Mm-hmm.
A place I might start here is, the question is your neighbor's daughter is looking for a summer internship. I might ask if anyone sort of encountered situations.
Yes. Like how many of you have neighbors whose daughters or sons are looking for an internship?
Right.
Yes.
And, with a smaller group, you can actually allow them, if you've developed sort of a rapport and participation and kind of a safe space for discussion, to drive the conversation a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
So that, we can start there and say, what do you think here? Have you encountered this? What are some questions that, you really face? Are there things that we could do to help you with these scenarios?
Mm-hmm.
And you may find that you have kind of a wide-ranging discussion that may require you to draw upon some knowledge outside of the ethics program.
Mm-hmm.
You might find that people are unclear about the personnel process in the agency.
Right. And nepotism statute.
Right. And, they don't experience the rules based upon the chapter you find them in the CFR.
Right.
Right. They encounter scenarios and all of the rules apply all the time. So it can be helpful there. So that might be a good way to start here is, has anyone been in these kind of situations and are there things that you would have liked help with?
Mm-hmm.
So we're still using kind of the same framework, but we're getting a little more specific and we're being a little more responsive to the actual situation.
Yeah, and it becomes almost more like an advice and counsel moment with the degree possibly even of specificity that you can get into, particularly if you find that it is actually a live situation for the people in the room. But I think this is an opportunity to be able to query folks about things that maybe you even suspect are going on. But you haven't had anybody come to you directly with a question. And this gives you a non-threatening way to initiate that conversation and get folks addressing, areas that you think may very well be, more common than not.
Yeah. So we could start that discussion, and you may find that you never really leave this slide,
Right. that this moves you on to so many other frontiers that, yeah.
But some of the things you might have, people might say, how should we go about designing internships?
Mm-hmm.
How do recommendations work? Do we have to go through the hiring process? You could have all sorts of questions that come out of here. And then that sort of leads you to the what do you do question, which can be really meaningful now.
Yes.
Right. If we've talked about some specific scenarios that people find themselves in, places where they felt under supported by the organization or weren't sure about how the policies worked or were put in an awkward position, you can talk about real honest to God strategies.
Yes. That
someone could engage in. It's like, so next time that happens, right? Next June, when this comes up, what are we going to do as an organization differently,
right,
to take care of some of these problems and take some of the pressure off? And you might actually come to some conclusions in the training, if you're in the room with the right people. So that can be a positive outcome.
Yeah, this is like a management conversation with ethics overtones, as opposed to just pure and simple or like, undiluted, ethics, quote unquote, training. Now this, you show how, the principles and the rules are all integrated into supporting the mission of the agency, and they're very much intertwined with policies and procedures, and so you're not sort of sitting out there peering in on management issues. You're actually, on the ground floor, sort of helping to cultivate strategies for different for different things.
And I think that's really nice, because then that feeds nicely into an approach to the principles and the rules that can help us to communicate about these situations, right? So next time you feel you may be pressured by someone to help them find an internship and you're concerned about the situation, you can give them a vocabulary through the ethics principles to respond to that scenario. So you could suggest something like, fairness is really important, right?
Right.
We can't be appearing to giving favorable treatment to someone under the principles. That's one of the ethics principles that we have to abide by. And now you've empowered your managers or supervisors or whoever your participants are with the vocabulary to respond in these situations. Because oftentimes people move forward just because they don't have the words to sort of take the action that they think is correct. And we can give that to them through the principles. And in the cases where the rules might apply, we can sort of show them the force behind those words.
Right. Well, and it gives, exactly. And that's a way to sort of preempt these things so that they're no longer having to come to you with the question, because they've been able to preempt by educating those who might seek these things from them about the limitations on their ability to do those things.
Exactly. So here, the rules we'd be talking about are, the impartiality rules, obviously misuse of position, but one they might not think about is, Section 205.
Right.
If someone asks you for an internship and you go to your boss and say, I know someone who would really like an internship here, can we make one? That's potentially a problem under a criminal statute. And it's good for our employees to know that. Right. So, we can sort of drive the conversation that way and make sure that our organizations have a sensitivity and processes to support people in sort of fulfilling their obligations under the law. I think let's just go through this next one quickly, and then we have a few minutes left. We can open up for questions.
That'd be great.
So, here's an example of a scenario that I think is familiar to folks, and we've been deliberately vague in some of these facts.
Right.
You're invited to a happy hour that's being organized by an organization that communicates with your agency. So we've not sort of slam dunk given you all the things you need for a gifts analysis. We've not given you sort of a slam dunk set of facts that they're going to be pushing for non-public information or
even whether the colleague in question is a government colleague or a non-government colleague.
So the hope here is that employees could bring to us the permutations.
Yes.
Right. So they can start to recognize the distinctions and the meaningful distinctions that could happen in a situation like this.
And they're going to bring to you, their first initial reaction is going to be how they would envision themselves experiencing it. So that's the other thing too, is that, they're going to tell you how they're likely to experience it. You're not crafting a fact pattern that may or may not resonate with them at all.
Exactly right. So if people who go to trade shows or conferences, they'll say, this doesn't happen to me in DC, but when I'm on travel at these trade shows, this comes up all the time.
Yeah.
What am I supposed to do?
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
And that's a very relevant and contextual way to present ethics to an employee, right? Because they're asking you about real life, things that they actually experience. And also the timing here is really interesting. We want employees to consider the ethics implications of their behavior before it comes time to act.
Yes.
Right. So this is at the time of the invitation. This isn't you've gotten there and someone's just picked up your check and, oh no, what do I do now? And that's not an accident, because we want people to be anticipating scenarios they might find themselves in, because there may be steps they can take to avoid awkwardness or sort of pressure under the ethics rules. And we want to explore that. So, this is a really good one to ask people what they think and to invite their thoughts and experiences in this area. And then, it moves very quickly to what do you do? Employers might say, well, just not going maybe isn't an option or isn't an ideal option. When would it be okay for me to go? Productive discussion to have.
Right.
Do I need to seek advice before I go, or do I just need to be aware of some things before I go? So you can talk about, sort of specific strategies that people can undertake. Is it simply enough to ask my boss if I can go? Is it enough just to make sure I pay for my own check?
Right.
What do I need to do?
Right. And you might be surprised by some of the things that come out of this too. I was hearkening back, Patrick, to like what people's initial experience of this might be. You might get somebody saying, what do I do if it's my supervisor who's asked me to go to this event? And now suddenly, you're not in the realm of it's a non-federal source that's offering some, it's now you're in the supervisor subordinate sort of realm,
right?
And that can take you off in a whole nother adventure of illumination about sort of ways in which supervisors are interacting with their subordinates.
Exactly. And then we can use the principles to sort of inform our thinking about this, and the rules to think about things that might happen. Because I think here, obviously, the gift issue is prominent. but you also want to think about the possible impartiality issues.
Impartiality, absolutely.
And some things people might not think about is like misuse of non-public information, right? You get there and you feel pressured, or you're invited to share information about ongoing agency activities that maybe haven't been made public. Are you prepared for that eventuality? Have you thought about it? Are you ready to deal with that? And likewise, if someone starts discussing an opportunity for employment outside of the government.
Exactly. That's exactly what I was thinking. Those kind of social environments are perfect for these very informal sort of employment overtures and solicitation of information and that sort of thing.
Exactly. So we want people to have thought about those things before they get there, because in the situation it can be hard to do the right thing, frankly.
Well, forewarned is forearmed,
That's
so
right.
that's really what we're trying to do, is arm people before they find themselves in an untenable situation.
So we just have a couple of minutes left, so I think it would be good if we go ahead and open it up to questions.
Okay.
So if you have any questions or comments on the Hangout, you can type them in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. And Angel, if we could open up the phone for questions, that would be great.
Again, if you would like to ask a question, please press star followed by the number 1. Please record your name clearly. One moment, please, for the first question.
Excellent. Thank you. While we're waiting, I just want to clarify that we were able to go through a few of these today, but we would encourage you to go through the rest of them and sort of review them and see if you could find a place for them in your annual training. We also want to make another offer that we'd like to see these being used in the wild.
Yes.
So if you think this is a good idea and you want to give it a try, and you wouldn't mind us bringing a couple of video cameras to see how this works in your agency, we'd be willing to help you facilitate that session. We'd love to do that for everyone, because we do like providing employees training, but resources being what they are.
Resources being what they are. There aren't enough of us to go around.
Right. We're really looking for a good opportunity for an example that we can use and share with the entire community to sort of show a good opportunity and use. So if you're interested in doing that, please send me an email or send Kanish an email, or reach out to your desk officer, and we can discuss whether or not your agency and scenario would be a good fit for that undertaking. I'm not showing any questions on the Hangout. Do we have any questions on the phone, Angel?
There are no questions on the phone.
One thing I did want to let folks know too, we're simultaneously working on materials for initial ethics orientation. And among the materials that you will be receiving that we're working on right now are a summary of the standards of conduct, which would be a somewhat more of an elaboration on each of the separate provisions in the standards of conduct, but relegating each pretty much to just a page, which you'll be able to give to not only your new employees, but if you'd like to use them in context of annual training, you certainly can do that as well. And a similar handout that would be for the statutes, the criminal statutes. We'll have a handbook for you that contains much of the same information that's in the handout that Patrick gave you today. With some steps. It's sort of outlining the same steps that we're doing in this training. We provide those steps as sort of the way to increase your awareness, increase your engagement, and to make yourself accountable as being sort of the process of ethical conduct that we're trying to encourage employees to engage in from day one. And then we will have some scenarios. Similarly, we'll have some scenarios for you to use in an instructor guide that will give you some discussion prompts and some suggestions for methodologies and techniques that you can use to deliver that training. But I do want to let you know that this is the approach that we're taking in initial ethics orientation as well. So it's kind of a universal application that we're trying here. And we think that once you have your initial ethics orientation following the same sort of patterns, then it will, facilitate your being able to use it, and it'll be a more familiar sort of step-by-step methodology that your employees will become accustomed to.
Yeah, and when we conducted our focus groups, one of the things that ethics officials told us it would be really helpful when providing in-person training is to reduce the learning curve for the instructor. We know that preparing to deliver an hour's worth of training that's brand new takes way more than an hour.
Yes.
The investment that the instructor has to make to get up to speed and ready to present is quite big, and we realize that's a disincentive to providing in-person training. So our hope here is that at least the teaching techniques are built in and consistent.
Yes.
So you only have to learn that part once.
Right.
The questions that you ask for each scenario are relatively similar. So you only have to learn that part once. And the specifics are the sort of bread and butter that we deal with every day.
Right.
And you'll notice that where we leave the analysis is not with a conclusion, but with a question. So you need a familiarity, but you don't really have to, be prepared to deliver a dissertation on each of the rules.
Right.
You just need to be able to sort of point out when and how they apply. So hopefully you'll find this to be a place that allows you to get ready for targeted training and in-person training more rapidly, and allows you to give effective training with a smaller investment of preparatory resources.
Yes. And I think so. Really, I think that the biggest piece that I think maybe people might feel most uncomfortable with is the facilitation piece, which is all the more reason why Patrick and I would be happy to come out and help folks with it, and then be able to create some sort of a video demonstrating it. Because I think once you can actually see a facilitation process, I think you'll come to embrace it, because it is a much more effective way to teach, and it's also much less of a heavy lift on the instructor.
No, that's exactly right. So we're just about finished with the hour, and I'm not showing any questions on the Hangout. Do we have any questions on the phone, Angel?
There are no questions on the phone.
Excellent. Well, thank you all for joining us today. We hope that you find these tools to be helpful and that you begin putting them to work. And we look forward to seeing the fruits of your labors.
Yes, very much so. Have a good afternoon.
See you next time.